All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this information session on progressive engagement tied to Homework Starts with Home. The purpose of this information session and the others that have followed it in the series are really to help interested potential applicants considering submitting a proposal for Homework Starts with Home to think about ways that they might build the various elements of the preliminary practice model that's part of that request for proposals into their application. And so we have a session today really focused on progressive engagement, and I'm excited about being able to share some of the content we'll cover today with you. Before we get started, just a few important logistics. This session is being recorded and may be posted online. We will leave ample time at the end for questions, and as you'll see in a moment, we're also going to give you a chance to ask questions throughout the session. And a couple of important housekeeping notes, especially for those joining remotely. Please make sure that you're muting your line unless you're speaking. That's important so that we are able to get a good recording and not pick up any background audio with the number of people that will be joining remotely. The audio controls on the webinar, if you're joining through GoToMeeting, are orange when you're muted. Please also make sure not to put the line on hold, because that can trigger hold music, which can be disruptive for the folks that are joining. And then just a heads up that we will not be monitoring the chat function, so we have another way that we would invite you to submit your thoughts and questions as we go through the session today. So to pose questions, we would really invite you to go to menti.com. And this is an interactive tool that will allow people that are here in the room and people that are joining remotely all to see simultaneously the same information and responses to a variety of questions that we'll pose. So all you have to do is either open up a new web browser window and go to menti, menti.com. And when you're there, you're going to be prompted to enter a code. That code is 59483. You can do that on a phone, on your computer, however you want to get there. And we'll go ahead and give that a try right now. So just to get us started, we're interested in understanding who's joining us today. So there's a question available on Menti right now for you to answer. Those of you that are joining remotely can also see the answers popping in. Folks that work in schools, county or tribal governments, public housing, homeless service organizations. Great. So we'll use that tool a few times throughout the session, and then at some point, actually just in a couple of slides from now, we're going to leave the Menti tool open for you to pose any questions that you have. You're welcome to do that throughout the session, and then in addition, Katharine will open up opportunities for you to ask questions as she's presenting. So with that, I am delighted to introduce Katharine Gale. Katharine is an independent consultant and also works with Focus Strategies based in the Bay Area. She is a consultant that supports a lot of local communities in doing kind of system improvement work and optimization for homeless response systems all across the country. I got to know Katharine as the policy director for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, where she led the work to develop the federal framework to prevent and end family homelessness called Family Connection, Building Systems to End Family Homelessness. That's a great resource and really features progressive engagement at its very center. You may have also seen the recently released report, Unlocking Doors to Homelessness Prevention. Katharine is a co-author of that report as well. Katharine, thanks so much for being here, and so I will hand this off to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks everyone both in the room and joining on the phone. As Eric said, I have the opportunity to travel around the country and work with communities who are really looking at how do we, in a situation of limited resources, which is always the situation that we're in, use our resources in the best way possible to end homelessness, both as much as possible, and particularly for people who, without our assistance, wouldn't be able to do it on their own. And in that context, I have been able to meet with communities that use a model called progressive engagement, which is also one of the things that they recommended or required strategy in the Homework Starts with Home programs that hopefully all of you will be designing. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I want to start, and somebody already answered, by asking a question. Are you familiar with this idea? So progressive, what are you talking about? I've never heard of this, or I know a little bit about it, but I'm not really applying it. I'm familiar with it and applying it in practice, or I'd happily get up there with you, Catherine, and co-lead this workshop. So we look like we have right now, all of the answers are progressive what now? Give it one more minute. All right. So we're going to really talk through then what does this concept mean. Good. One person with some familiarity.
You want to go? You're on the other screen. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right. So actually, since we're going to talk about this largely in the context of rapid rehousing, although not exclusively, I also wanted to get a sense of how familiar folks on the phone and in the room are with rapid rehousing. So rapid what now? I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I'm familiar. I'm really familiar with that. I'm experienced or operating it now, and I've really got this down. I'm an expert. So, oh, and I need to go over and say activate. Oh, this is what I meant to do.
I just slide to the other screen.
Oh, right. It needs to go there and activate on the screen. Apologies.
There you go.
Yeah. All right. So we have a little bit of a kind of divided group here. Some folks for whom this is very new, and other people who are quite familiar with that. I'm not surprised that many of you are quite familiar. This concept of rapid rehousing actually has its origins in part here in Hennepin County, where it was originally piloted as rapid exit and became kind of a standard for the rest of the country. So we've developed that out. So for those of you who are not familiar, I will try to kind of put some of that in context as we talk about it, but please feel free to submit your questions as we go. We'll save time at the end, but definitely if you're not clear about what we're talking about here or you have questions, please let me know as we go along. All right, let's get started. So progressive engagement, what is it? Basically, progressive engagement is an approach to how we help households end their homelessness as quickly as we can, using the least financial and service support resources we can to be successful with each household. And you'll notice that I've italicized both parts of that, because it's not just about doing the least we can. It's not about intentionally providing less than we need to. It's just about providing what we have to and not more in order to be successful, so that typically we can go on and serve more folks, and also for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute that have to do with also what appears to be more successful. And sometimes this term is referred to as progressive assistance. I'll say I don't know that either of these kind of naming, progressive engagement or progressive assistance, is the best terminology that we could use, and if anybody comes up with a better way to describe this, we'd love to have a term that is explanatory in the way we talk about it. So basically, how it works is that we initially make an offer of some kind of light touch or basic package of services support. That could be something like problem-solving support or diversion when people first begin to say, hey, I'm experiencing a housing crisis. We could be looking at what can we do today that might help you, maybe a little bit of money, maybe a little bit of support. Or within the rapid rehousing context, it could be a short-term rapid rehousing model. So for example, a 3 to 4 month program that provides some deposit support, a little bit of initial assistance, but is intended to be fairly light touch, fairly short term, with the idea that for some folks, that's going to be enough. That's going to be good. They're going to be fairly stable. We're going to be able to let go, but that there are also going to be households that aren't going to be sufficiently stable after whatever that initial period is, 3 to 4 months, and who are going to need more support. and who we're going to need to provide additional support to, either financial or support services or both, and that we can do that because we have this flexible and individualized model rather than a cookie cutter, rather than something that says this is a 6-month program, this is a 12-month program. This is about saying this is about helping to get you into housing and having a fairly good reason to believe that you'll be able to stay there. And this design is informed by what we know about the patterns of crisis, how things change for people over time, how people recover from crisis, how things get better, and also how low-income households live in situations that are sometimes a little more marginal than we might like them to be, and yet can be very stable. So maybe it's helpful to sort of say what progressive engagement is not, because sometimes I think people think, oh yeah, we do that, and then we start to talk about it, and we realize, no, that's not really what we're talking about. So one thing it's not is a predetermined program length or amount for everyone, right? One size fits all. This is a 12-month program. You're going to get your rent paid for that period of time, and then it ends at the end of that, regardless of what's going on for you. So not one size fits all. But it's also not a predetermined step down of assistance. So we don't design our program to say, we're going to pay 100% of your rent for the first 3 months, and then after that, we're going to pay 70%, and then 3 months later, we're going to pay 30%, and then when we get to months 9 through 12, you're going to be paying the full rent, and we're going to be paying 0. And I'll talk a little bit about why it isn't that in a minute. And it's also not about predetermining on the basis of somebody's score or assessment what they're going to need. So we apply some kind of assessment tool, and someone scores a 10, and we say, oh, that person is a 10, so they're going to need 12 months, right? So the idea is that we're not starting out with a predetermined length or a package of assistance based on the things that either we designed a program that way or something about the household coming in. Like to say, labels are for jars and not for people, so we don't talk about people as 10s and 5s adults, but we're facing a housing crisis. So why do we do this? Well, first of all, it's a housing first model. It says what we're going to do is help to get a household that doesn't have a place to live back into housing immediately without a lot of preconditions, and then figure out what kind of support is going to be needed to help people stabilize. And that could be a wide range of things, not just financial assistance, other kinds of services. But we put the getting back into housing as the primary goal, and then what it's going to take. And the reason we use progressive engagement is because we know that assessment at the time of crisis doesn't always predict the future well. So when people are in crisis, there can be a lot going on that includes mental health symptoms, depression, that could include using substances, that could include a lot of family tension, that could include children not doing well in school or high rates of absenteeism, that aren't about what the sort of family is in some deep sense, but it's about what's going on in the moment of crisis. So if we assess people at that moment, we might come up with a very long list of things that are wrong or need help. But what we might find out is that when the crisis is over and when people are back in housing, a lot of those things are able to be resolved, either with our help or just because they resolve themselves, because the situation that's causing them has actually changed. And therefore, the things that we thought when we did an assessment were going to need help, now maybe we have a different set of conditions to respond to. Likewise, people can be really keeping it together when they're in crisis and not exposing some of the things that might be going on. And then when folks get into housing, other things may start to emerge. So progressive engagement acknowledges that just because something is currently true or was true in the past doesn't necessarily predict the future. That doesn't mean we ignore those things. We know, for example, that past episodes of homelessness can be predictive of future episodes of homelessness. So we're not suggesting we pretend that we're working in a complete blank slate, but we also don't hold on to the idea that because this is happening now, we're going to have to do a lot to address it. We start to address the crisis, we start to address the housing needs, and then we figure out whether or not there's going to be additional kinds of supports needed and what they are. So in that way, it's much more responsible to the individual situations that people are in than some kind of predetermined program. And it also reduces false or unhelpful expectations, because what we found is that if we support people potentially for a longer period of time than they really need, we actually make it harder for that transition to go smoothly. Because, of course, you and I would, if we were in a situation where we were going to get 6 or 12 months of double the money that we get right now, or somebody paying our rent, it's pretty easy to get into living in a way that's commensurate with that set of resources, and then they're not going to be there. So progressive engagement says we do what we need to do in the moment, and we reduce those false or unhelpful expectations. And ultimately, doing this is important because it lets us serve more families in need, because if we're not giving everyone 12 months of assistance, some people are doing well with 4 or 6, and other people are needing 12 or possibly 18. Overall, we're going to be able to help more families. And this leads to kind of a big question in rapid rehousing and overall, which is really how much is enough? How do we know what the right amount of assistance or time in a program is? And the answer is we don't really know that, because what we can see in the data is that rapid rehousing programs of varying length and depth have pretty similar success rates. That is, they're fairly successful most of the time with most families. It's a really good model that works with a lot of families and household types, and you can do a program that lasts a fairly long period of time, and you can do one that's sort of lighter, and for the most part, the success rates look similar. Now, longer programs with longer stays in the program tend to look a little bit better for income changes. And that makes sense, right? It takes a little bit longer to get that job or to get that increase, particularly if you're expecting people to increase their income. But shorter programs also look pretty good, and they particularly look good when you talk about how many people finish the program with someone else. So there's a balancing act here. When we do shorter program stays, it lets us help more households with the same resources. But we still want to make sure, as I said, that we're helping people to be successful. So we're not just arbitrarily saying, this is a 3-month program because that's going to be better and we're going to serve more people. We're saying this is going to be a program of indeterminate length with the intention of being as short as possible in order to allow people to stabilize in their housing and be successful. There's a question.
So, Katharine, the question is, progressive engagement doesn't seem like it would work well for people in deep poverty. Why did you pick this as the practice model?
So there are an awful lot of people in deep poverty who are not homeless. In a starting place that rapid rehousing and programs like this are not really intended to end people's poverty. We'd like to help set people up to move out of poverty if possible, but we also know that there's an awful lot of people living in poverty who are not homeless. And in fact, that most households that are assisted back into housing in whatever models that we have don't necessarily leave poverty, and certainly not in the short run. So we're not setting up the program model to be about getting households out of poverty. And it's not my understanding, but I would defer to you, Eric, on this, that Homework Starts with Home is particularly saying every household has to get out of poverty. I think what we're looking for is stability, having a place to live, improvements in school situations, improvement in family life and functioning, which could include, and hopefully does include in the long run, getting out of poverty, but we don't make that a condition of actually getting into housing or being able to keep your housing.
And I would thank you, Katharine. And this is Eric from Eric Grumdahl from the Department of Education and the State Office to Prevent Homelessness. I realized I don't think I introduced myself earlier. The only thing that I'd add to that, Katharine, is that really part of the reason that progressive engagement is a core piece of the preliminary practice model is the idea that we want to balance simultaneously making sure that every family and student that's supported by the program is successful in terms of moving back into housing, stabilizing their housing situation, and achieving those educational improvements, and at the same time serve as many students and families as we can with the resources that we have available. Given the large number of homeless students that we identify every year in Minnesota, the resources that are allocated to this initiative are far short of what it'll take to end student homelessness in Minnesota, and so we want to make sure that we are stretching them as far as we can, simultaneously achieving success for the families we serve.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, that one of the things that we know from the research is if we had the ability to give low-income households permanent housing subsidies like Section 8, there would be much higher rates of stability and people would have more income to work with and things like that. So if we had that ability, we certainly wouldn't be opposed to having long-term or indefinite time supports and subsidies. But without that ability, what the evidence shows is that for many families, getting out of a homelessness crisis back into their own housing and some support to stabilize there and be able to retain that housing actually ends that crisis more quickly, and in most cases means that homelessness was short and one time and people don't return to homelessness even if they stay poor and in poverty. So let me talk a little bit then about assessment, because one of the things that is sometimes a little puzzling about the progressive engagement approach is that we're not using a bunch of indicators about how people are doing now to decide how long they're going to need support for. And in many communities, and those of you on the phone who identified that you're homeless service providers, we're creating coordinated entry systems that actually start out by assessing everyone and trying to give us some information about what's going on, and in some cases using that to try and match to an appropriate intervention. So it's not to say that there is no place for assessment. In fact, we do need to know things. We need to know a lot about what's going on in terms of what's the household's history, what are their plans, what are their desires, what is it that they would like to achieve, where would they like to live, how can we help to make that a reality. And we also need to understand what kind of housing barriers the household is facing. Not because we're going to say, oh, you have too many barriers, you have a criminal background or you have a past eviction, we can't house you, but because if part of our program design is about getting families back into housing, we need to know what's going on so that we can work better with landlords, help identify places that they're going to be able to afford that will accept them. And those of you on the phone who said you're fairly familiar in operating rapid rehousing know that you're using all of that information to figure out that what family A can either afford or where they'll be able to get in or who will rent to them may be very different from family B. So it's not that we're going in blind. And that helps us develop a realistic approach. And it also helps us understand what kinds of supports in the community a household might need. This household may need help getting childcare. This household may need help getting into an employment program, healthcare or mental health supports, and those are all things we're going to want to know. But what we're saying with the progressive engagement approach is that all of that information doesn't necessarily tell us how to size the financial assistance, how long we're going to need to use it for, how much to give, or how long we're going to need to support people for. And that's for the reasons that I said, because things can change. So let me give an example of that. In the job market, if we're going to go out and look for a job today, and we know nothing about what's going on except what the job market search average length of time is, we might design a program that says everybody's going to get 3 months of assistance because that's how long we think it's going to take for them to get a job and done. But in reality, we know that people experience both because a job suddenly comes open or because they wake up on the wrong side of the bed and go into the interview and do poorly, or their brother-in-law comes along and offers them a job. None of those things are things that we can really predict. So even if we do a lot of assessment and say, what's your education, how many jobs have you had, what did you make before, all of that, that can help us to think about how to support each individual, and it can give us some general ideas about how long we're going to need to provide support for overall. But it also makes us realize that we just don't know who's going to get a job when. And so we're kind of both planning on an arc or a kind of a range of possibility and leaving open the possibility that something is going to happen quickly or more slowly than we intended it to, or that luck or persistence or other things that we can't really measure for are going to come into play. And one household that we predicted was going to take 4 months to get settled is actually good after 2, and another is going to take 6. So the way in which we're using our assessment information is to inform how we engage, but not to sort of set a predetermined end. So maybe it will help to look at what that can look like. So this is an example from Cleveland. They use a progressive engagement model with their rapid rehousing for all families. So basically, any family who becomes homeless and enters the homeless system is offered rapid rehousing. And what they're offered is a fairly short length of support. It's a 4-month program. And that happens for all families. And then at the end of that 4 months, families are in 2 different potential situations. One is they're doing well. They can maintain their housing without any ongoing subsidy, and the program can let them go. And the other is that they're not, and they need some extended rental assistance and some more case management, maybe even more intensive services. And so they can stay in or go to a provider that can do up to an additional 8 months of rent. And at the end of that time, many of those families are going to be fine, that bottom box, and they're going to maintain their housing and they'll be done. And some of them are going to need something deeper, and they have a small amount of permanent housing vouchers and public housing that they can provide at the end of that time. Now, why didn't we just provide that right up front at the beginning? Because we don't have enough of it. And on the basis of an assessment, we may not be able to actually predict well who's really going to need that support for all the reasons that I just said about how things can develop over time. So let me show you what their actual numbers look like. These are their 2017 numbers. In 2017, 343 families were served in a rapid rehousing program. Some of them were still in at the end of this data, so we're just going to allow that they were still in the program. But 267 families finished that 4-month program, and of those, 70% were done after 4 months. That was enough time for them to be able to be in their own housing, stop getting rental subsidy, stop getting the support services of the rapid rehousing program, ideally attached to other kinds of services in the community. And of those, they know that within the next year, only 12 of those households re-experienced homelessness and entered shelter. So 185 out of 267 done after 4 months, and I do the math right here, 173 of them not returning to homelessness and not losing their housing again, as far as we know. But of those 267, 82 of them, about 30%, at the end of 4 months, really weren't stable, needed more assistance, needed what they call a second shot. And so they're enrolled in something, sorry for the initials, VHS is just the name of the provider in that case, that can give them up to another 8 months of assistance. But that assistance isn't, oh, 4 months wasn't enough, now you get 8. It's 4 months wasn't enough, let's try another. Let's try another. Let's figure out what's going to need to be done next so that we can back away as quickly as we can, but we're going to continue to be in there with you and support you if we need to. And at the end of that time, of course, there were more people who were still in the program, but of the 32 who had left that, 11 were able to go on with no subsidy, and 21 in this case did need a subsidy. So that a little higher rate of people needing something deeper. But in the end, out of 343 families, at the end of that year, only 21 actually needed to be in a permanent subsidy program that's going to give them public housing or Section 8 or some kind of voucher for the long term. By doing this, they allowed the proof to be in the pudding, essentially, the households to demonstrate through their actual experience, not through making assumptions or assessments of them at the beginning, who was going to need that deeper level of support. And that fits with what they actually have to offer. So they're not saying, well, we've got 300 families that could all use a voucher, but we've only got 20. So on the basis of how you look today, we're just going to give those out, and everybody else is going to have to do something later, and it's just going to have to work. They're using the process to actually be, in a way, a form of assessment over the territory as it goes on. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if there are any questions coming in, because now I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you do this.
Yes, we have another one. Thank you. The question is, how seamless is the process for getting clients into other programs, especially if it's a different provider?
That is a really good question. And that really depends on how we design things. So in some cases, that moving from, say, the 4 months to the potentially longer and deeper case management with longer financial assistance doesn't actually involve changing providers at all. In some cases, it doesn't even involve changing the subsidy stream or the program. So it can be completely continuous. You can practice progressive engagement within a single funding stream and a single model. You just have the ability to go out as long as you need to, and you practice these same principles. But in some cases, communities or providers are using a variety of different sources to do this. A good example of that is TANF resources are often limited to only being used for about 4 months, but they can make a great starting place. So in some communities, 4 months of TANF assistance is the standard for that basic package. And then for the folks that was enough for, great, we let go, people are stable, we go on to the next household. But for those who need more, there's a transition to another resource. Sometimes it's a HUD resource, like a continuum of care or emergency solutions grant. Sometimes it's local funding. And exactly to the questioner's point, you want that process to be as smooth as possible for the household, ideally almost invisible to them. Now, in the Cleveland case, it's my understanding that they do change providers. And the reason that they do that is that the provider has both the deeper resources and also the ability to do deeper case management. And there's a handoff process to make that clear. And of course, there's also all along the way client choice around this. So households could be offered that opportunity. We can end the program now. Seems like you might be struggling a little bit, or this program over here could work with you over a longer period of time. You'd be meeting a new case manager. Let's make that connection. Would you like to do that? But it is on us to make sure that that process isn't one of my program is ending, you're being handed off to this other program, and good luck with that, right? We need to make sure that our systems make that as smooth as possible. Same with the permanent housing resources if we have them on the back end. So if we're working with our public housing authority, I think we had a public housing authority on the call, and they've said, we're willing to put some vouchers in for those households that are still struggling after 12 or 18 months, right? And we're going to use this method as our way of figuring out who needs that. Then when that comes up, we need to be working together to figure out what's the paperwork that needs to happen, what's the time elapsed. Sometimes that can take a little bit of time. And so we're backing up from that time frame. If we're doing 12 months of assistance as the max in our rapid before we're going to do a voucher, we may need to know by month 10 and a half, 11, this is the direction that we're going so we can get that piece started so that it's continuous. The whole point of all of this is that the family never has to move and leave the housing that they're in if they don't want to, because whatever subsidies we're using or supports can come in, they're stable, they're staying there. So it's really different from the old days where we used to have transitional housing or shelters to transitional and then to something else where the family was constantly having to move when the program was over. In this case, the family stays where they are, the program or funding stream switches out, and we continuously work with them until we can let go. Other questions? All right, keep moving. So how do you deliver this? I just want to say it's challenging, right? Because we're used to the idea that we can explain to people, this is a 12-month program and here's what's going to happen. And after 3 months, this is going to happen, and then we're going to cut your rent in half, and then these kinds of things. And in this case, we're actually being clear from the beginning with the household. This is a program where the housing support is intended to be short, maybe whatever your basic package is. We're going to work with you for the first 4 months, but it's very flexible. We're going to stay in it with you. We're going to be able to help you get settled. And we also express that we have a lot of confidence in that. We have a lot of confidence that this is going to be enough. And we're going to work on it with you. You're not in this alone. But if it isn't, we're not going to sort of just drop people. So we're both sending the message that that we have confidence that they can do it, that this works for a lot of the folks that we're working with, that we're going to put things in place to help you with that. And we're not going to just let you go if things aren't going well. And we're going to keep checking in, and we're going to keep doing reassessment. I don't even like that word. That's our word, reassessment. We're going to keep checking in. We're going to keep knowing what's going on and seeing whether or not the things that we said needed to be in place in order to let go are actually in place. Another thing is that we really focus on addressing housing entry barriers first. So we don't try to do everything all at once. So we're not simultaneously trying to get all of the things that are going on with the family and the kids and jobs and healthcare and parenting skills and looking for housing all at once. We're really focusing right at the beginning on what's it going to take to get that housing. And so we focus on the things that are going to be barriers to getting into housing first, and then we focus on what's going to be actually a barrier to retaining that housing based on either things that have actually had impact in the past on people being able to keep their housing or are starting to impact their housing once they're housed. And we connect as much as we can to the services that people are going to want and need as quickly as we can so that we have those connections. Now, this program model is a collaborative program model. You're going to have schools, you're going to have homeless service providers probably, and maybe other providers in your community like employment providers or other ways that you're structured. So maybe you've already got some of that built into your partnerships, but however you design it, you want to make sure that you've got those connections to make sure that you can provide those services when they're needed. But we don't throw everything at folks all at once. So what does that look like? So there's a big difference between what causes people to be unable to get into housing and what causes people to not keep their housing. And we want to be clear about those differences. So we start by thinking about things in terms of, we call them tenant screening barriers, the things that are actually what landlords are looking for when they're deciding who to rent to. And we need to know the same things that the landlords are likely to know. And those are things like, what's going on with income, right? Can you pay the rent? What's going on with their credit? Do they have a criminal background? For some landlords, that's an issue. For others, it's not. Folks on the phone who said they were rapid rehousing providers have probably housed a lot of folks with a criminal background, and they do it because they know that not every landlord looks at or cares about the same thing. Whether they have evictions, whether they have references from other landlords or have had a lease in the past. And our programs ask those things not to say, oh, this is going to be impossible, but because we can then help them to overcome those things, and we can design a housing plan that focuses on those things. What you'll notice is that there are things that are not in that list that sometimes we think of as barriers for households. Examples of that, I'm going to ask a couple of the folks in the room maybe to help me think about what are some other things that we tend to think about are going to make it hard for people to get housed. Drug relapse. Drug use, drug relapse, right? So that's a great example. What might be going on with people's health or mental health? It's not that those things may not need to be addressed, but unless they're going to be very obvious to a landlord at the time that we're looking for housing, we don't have to think of those as those are barriers to them getting into housing. Now, they may be barriers that are going to come up later when we're talking about staying housed. But even there, the lens that we bring to that is, what is it going to take now that this household is in their own housing for them to be able to abide by that lease and keep that housing? So the kinds of things that people have to be able to do to stay housed basically boil down to 3 or 4 things. The first is they have to be able to pay the rent on time or in full. So drug relapse could impact that ability if people aren't using their money to pay their rent because they're using their money to pay for drugs, right? But the issue isn't that the drug relapse is what's threatening their housing, but how is the behavior actually threatening the housing? Likewise, you have to be able to care for and not destroy the property, right? These are big, important things in leases. Doesn't mean you have to be a great housekeeper. If people got thrown out of their housing because they were messy, we'd have a lot more homeless people than we do. But you do have to be able to basically care for the property, both your unit and for the property itself. And you also have to be able to not disturb the quiet enjoyment of others. This is sort of lease term language, right? What that translates into is you're not bringing guests around in the middle of the night, and you're not playing your music super loud, and a lot of other things that sometimes people need skills for. and that when they don't, it can be reflective of something else that's going on. And then really the last is not violate other lease terms, and particularly the ones that will get the landlord in trouble. So another thing that drug relapse could mean is that you're involved in illegal activities, and that can threaten your lease. But the focus at the end, once we've gotten folks housed, is really about the program staying in as long as it needs to be able to make sure that the household can do those things, can pay the rent on time and in full, care for the property, and be good tenants. And we provide supports around that are geared toward that. Now, I know in this program, you're also concerned about children and what's going on with the children and their ability to get to school or do well in school or access the kind of services that they need in school. So you have a set of additional things that you may be looking at that you're concerned about, but when we're thinking about what it's going to take for people to stay housed and why progressive engagement might back away and other services might stay in, is because we're really focusing on what it's going to take for people to stay in the house. And this is just a picture that sort of shows the same kind of thing, where you're focusing on tenant screening barriers at the beginning to obtain housing, and then housing retention barriers to sustain housing. So I just kind of came up with a couple of families to think about here as we think about what could this look like. So in my first family, I have a single mother and two children, 3 and 7 years old, so one school age. For over a year, they've been living between their shelter and their car. The mother's unemployed and has TANF assistance. She worked before she had her second child. She reports feeling depressed and using alcohol, and her school-age child is having behavioral problems and high absenteeism. So when we look at this household, does this look like a household that you're familiar with? Seen this before? So when we look at this household, there's a lot going on there. And we're going to have to tease out what are the things that we need to address right away in order to get into housing, and what are the things that are or might emerge as housing retention barriers later that progressive engagement is going to help us engage around. Likewise, we have a second family here, two-parent household with one son who's 12. They're staying at the father's sister after they were recently evicted. The child is attending school but is behind academically. Father's working part-time, mother has a disability, and father has a previous felony. All of that information is going to help us in thinking about a housing stability plan, what kind of housing we might be able to get, how quickly, what kind of income they may or may not have at the beginning to start to pay for housing. But as you can see, many of those things could be things that once we get folks housed, they're going to be able to address in a very different way. So if we just look at that mom is depressed and using alcohol, we might think we have a big problem and we need a lot of mental health services and or alcohol and drug treatment. But it might turn out that when we have a place to live and we're not back and forth between the car and the shelter, that some of those things actually are a reaction to the situation and not sort of either causal or ongoing. Now that may not be true too. So the questions that I wanted us to think about were about what are we assuming about who will be easier to house and who will need longer assistance, but also what more would we need to know, and how would we provide some services for that? And most importantly, in the progressive engagement model, what are the things that could change once you start working with them? So if folks on the phone or in the room have some thoughts about that, I'm sorry I can't show both slides at the same time, but do you have kind of, when you think about that, does it seem like, oh, one of those families would be a lot easier to work with than the other, or I really feel like we're going to need to provide a whole list of services right away? The most important thing, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say at first glance, I would assume that, or it looks like families need to be easier to work with, or maybe less barriers, at least especially
Right.
less barriers to address because there is an income coming in partially. At least child is regularly attending, which gives more options to help as opposed to the other ones as chronic destroyed or has a high.
Right. So at first glance, surely it does look like, although there are some barriers for family B, that family B may be easier to work with at first and may get housed more quickly. There's more, looks like there's income. The other side doesn't really have as much income. They haven't been living outside or in their car recently, right? They're doubled up. On the other hand, a lot of what might be going on for family A could be a result of the current situation that they're in. We don't know why she's back and forth between shelter and her car. We don't know whether that's because of shelter rules that don't work for her and her family, or whether that's because she can't really do well in that environment. We don't know whether the school-age child having the problems in school is because of the conditions that they're living in right now, right? And the child who's behind, is regularly attending school, but is behind academically, potentially actually has more challenges that we also don't know, because we haven't assessed for them yet, that could be, that are needing some kind of ongoing support, whereas the child who's missing school could be missing school because they're living in their car. So exactly to the point, we shouldn't make assumptions. We do have to find out, we have to ask good questions, but we also need to keep in mind this last bullet point, which is that things could change once we start working with them. Things could change in both positive and negative directions, but more often than not, getting into housing has a positive salutary effect on a lot of things that can look more either long-lasting, severe, or necessary to be addressed when we're working with folks who are in unstable housing conditions. So that's the primary point, is really to think about those things, to kind of have those conversations, to question assumptions, and to be open to providing the support as it's needed. So progressive engagement really recognizes those things. Some of the things that look like they could be challenges or obstacles really could be resulting from the current situation. Things can change. We don't predict the future very well, so it's important to know the past. And it also takes away the labels and assumptions. It really focuses on the goal. So instead of thinking, this is a chronic family, for example, was one of the words that was used. This is a family that's been living in an unstable situation for a fairly long period of time at this point, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to be housed or have never been housed before. And what that chronicity could be about could be as much about what our system did or didn't offer them as about their capacity to be housed. We have to think about that, how we offer our support. And it encourages families to progress while allowing for them to have setbacks. So it's reality-based. It's positive reinforcing of progress while allowing for that we all can experience setbacks. And particularly, very low-income households can experience crises, job loss, health situations that actually really, start to move toward not having money anymore, all of those kinds of things. And being there and responding to them when they happen, as opposed to sort of predicting that they will or have and therefore always will, is also much more kind to the people that we're working with. So how do we do this? We're kind of repeatedly assessing for stability using clear but flexible criteria. What does that mean? Clear but flexible. So clear means we know what the things we're looking at are. Do they have sufficient income to be able to pay the rent? Not necessarily to be out of poverty, not necessarily to be paying only 30% of their income for rent, which would be great but is unlikely, but enough income to be able to pay the rent on a fairly regular basis and still be able to cover basic needs. And we've helped to figure out other ways to support them to do that, connecting them to food, to other services, etc. Are they in compliance with their lease? Have they made the connections in the community that we wanted to get started, or the services that they need, so that ongoing supports that aren't about housing can continue to be delivered? And also, what's their choice? Do they feel ready? Are they saying, I'm good, I've got this, right? We respect that. Or is there something going on? Is the crisis itself still active, or has a new crisis come along? Now we know mom got a job and that was all going well, but then suddenly a health thing came up, or one of the children got sick, and now she's not able to work as many hours. So now we need to think about increasing what we're doing. But we also have to ask, do people in other similar situations make it? right? Is this situation, while tenuous, one that most people who are living in poverty actually are able to make it in? And are we going to be able to say, we don't have to continue with the housing subsidy right now, even though we're going to provide other kinds of support? If we're going to continue, how little can we try? Do we need to continue to pay the full rent, if that's what we were doing? If now we've got some income, but things aren't quite stable, can we say, how about a couple $100 this month? Would that make the difference, right? Let's try it, because we're trying to also create the expectation that this isn't going to be here forever. So let's try it. Should we stop the subsidy but maintain services? And if we need to change things, we can both actually increase or lower what we're doing. So we have lots of flexibility in that. And here's a kind of a chart that sort of shows similar kinds of things. What are we looking for when we're thinking about, is this family ready for us to end the housing support or not? Have we gotten to the place where things are in fairly good shape and we've done what we said we wanted to do? Or are there other things going on that really mean that we need to stay in a little bit longer? How do we decide that? There's lots of options for that. Can be structured conversations with the client about what's going on. Could be regular case conferencing within the team. Could be that folks are sitting around together and saying, I'm dealing with this family on these issues, and this thing seems to be going pretty well. What's happening in terms of the housing piece? What's happening in terms of the kids? It could be that you have a supervisor making those determinations based on recommendations. And the reason that I put that up there is sometimes when folks are working directly with the families, households, case managers are working with the families, it's helpful for them to be able to say, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to continue to assist you past this month, so let's really work on it working this month, but I will advocate for you if it's not working, so that somebody else is making that decision. So these are kind of design choices. We also might be looking at some relative needs. We have a lot of other families that we want to be able to serve, so how are we doing here? Is this the right month to be able to say, let's try a little less? And we might be using assessment tools, but I'm going to suggest that we don't just use an assessment tool. So we may be using one that gives us some kind of score, and we're looking at, has there been improvement? Improvement on stability, improvement on school participation, improvement on income. But we're not just saying this score says X, and so we either continue or don't. We're looking at the totality of the situation. So kind of wrapping up around how this can look, if you're going to be building this into some kind of program design, you have some design questions that you have to ask. So what's our starting or basic package? What are we assuming that we're going to offer pretty much from the get-go to every household that we work with? What's the resource for that? What does that look like? How do we package it? And why? What do we think? And I would say for those of you who are in the home of service programs, you probably have a pretty good sense right now of what's working for most families. So what's the right sort of starting place? And then what are the roles of each of the partners in the project when the family is seeking housing and when the family is housed? And those are important distinctions to make so that we're not all trying to cover everything at once, but maybe we're starting focusing on a couple of things, and the folks who are the housing specialists are going to be working, and then once the family's housed, we're going to begin to work on some different set of things, and the folks who are working with kids may be doing one set of things while the kids are in flux and not housed, and a different set of things when people are in housing. What are the indicators that we're going to use for ending or continuing our financial support, these kind of reassessment things that I talked about? And what are the indicators that we're going to use for ending or continuing our services support? And will those be different for different members of the household because we're offering different types of services? Who's going to be involved in these decisions as we go, as we're making this, so that we're making sure that we're in touch with each other? And how are we going to communicate externally about this model? Because if this is different from what we've been doing before, then some of our partners in the community might be like, wait a minute, I thought everybody got 12 months of assistance. How come family X is no longer in this part of your program? So those are things to think about in advance as you design. And now I'm going to reopen again for questions. Did I go over and activate this?
Yeah, that'll show. You have to do it on the.
Yeah, you told me that.
Go the other way. There you go.
So we talked a little bit about why it might not work for people in deep poverty. How seamless is the process? We talked about that. How do you budget and project the number of families you serve? That is a really great question. So kind of back to my analogy around if you have a bunch of people who are all engaging in a job hunt and you know something about averages, you are going to have to budget for the idea that some people are going to need a short amount of support and some people are going to need a longer amount of support, but that there's going to be an average amount that you're spending per household. And if you're going to have a program that starts out with, say, a basic 4-month package and can go out to 12 or 18 months, then you do a little bit of designing some projections. And if you've got partners around your table who've been doing something like this, you might want to ask them about what are they seeing. So how many households tend to leave? You could look at, I showed you the Cleveland example, but there are examples from other communities as well that tend to show that somewhere around 50 or 60% of the households will be okay with the basic package. The rest may need something longer, and a fairly small number, 10, 15, 20%, might need the deepest subsidies that you have. So you're going to start with some assumptions, ideally data informed, and then you're going to have to track it very, very closely, because you don't want to be in the situation where you can't offer more support when you need to because we've enrolled too many people. So you are going to be a little bit cautious there. You're going to start out with some budget projections, and you're going to have good, sophisticated people on your team who are tracking as you go, and you're looking at it on a regular basis. So you don't start out by the beginning of the program saying, we're going to serve 40 households, and then we enroll 40, and then we're done. You start out by saying, we're assuming an average of 8 months, with some folks being 4 and some folks being 12. We know roughly what our rents look like, and that we're going to pay half the rent for most folks, and if at times different amounts. I'm going to budget for that, I'm going to project that, and then I'm going to be tracking it really closely month to month to see whether I need to slow down my enrollment a little bit, or maybe I can enroll a few more people. But it is a developed habit and skill within organizations that do this, and the more you do it, the more information you have to inform your design. Want to add anything to that? No. Other questions? There are resources.
Actually, before you go on, Katharine,
Sure.
One could say that there's something inherent in the rapid rehousing model that is progressive engagement. So how do the two ideas differ, right? If rapid rehousing kind of has this component in it of assessing and offering more if needed, what does progressive engagement add to rapid rehousing?
Well, so I'll say two things about that. First of all, even within that sort of being built into most rapid rehousing programs, there still are a lot of rapid rehousing programs that the reassessment is around, maybe it's done every 3 months, and then it's either a yes/no decision and another 3 months. So it's yes, some folks are going to be 6 and some folks are going to be 9, but the idea still is it's structured in this like chunk way, as opposed to in progressive engagement, which is really after the basic package. This is going on a monthly basis. It's very fluid, and it also allows for being able to come in with more, not just backing away. So somebody suddenly encounters another situation or a crisis, you could actually come back in and start paying the whole rent again. And some rapid rehousing programs do that, but not all do. But the other piece, and I think this is what you're alluding to, Eric, is that it doesn't just have to be within rapid rehousing. We might be starting out from the very beginning with not even offering a rapid rehousing program if we don't need to. If somebody has income and they've been housed before, and their situation is that the crisis has left them with no money for deposit, or with things on their record that are going to make it hard for them to get a landlord to take them, but once they get in, they're going to be fine, we might just start with that. So it might even be pre-rapid rehousing or diversion, which I don't know if we're going to have much of an opportunity to sort of talk about in this program, but for people who haven't even lost their housing yet, we might be figuring out, do we even need to enroll in a longer term program, or do we need to figure out how to support what's going on here to make that stick? So that would be part of progressive engagement. Then within rapid rehousing, having this flexible approach. And then as I talked about in the Cleveland model, having something in your back pocket that is that deeper subsidy for the folks who, even with our deepest support in our rapid rehousing program, really aren't going to make it. Now we know. We've been trying this for 12 or 18 months, and that stability just never really gets there. Or new issues have emerged. What was going on was masking something much deeper that's actually causing a situation where this household's really not going to be able to maintain their housing on a short-term subsidy at any point in the future, and we need to do something deeper, and that deeper might be a permanent subsidy, public housing, might even be permanent supportive housing where there's ongoing services that are available. So the progressive engagement model doesn't just happen within one program type rapid rehousing, but ideally covers the entire gamut or spectrum of things that we have to offer. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? So there are some places to find more resources about this. The National Alliance to End Homelessness, www.endhomelessness.org, has a lot of resources around rapid rehousing in general and around progressive engagement. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness also has some information about progressive engagement. And you're also welcome to contact me, and I have some additional resources that I can send to you about this. I'm happy to do that. And you also have the opportunity to get additional trainings related to this opportunity that's on the table. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Great.
Thanks very much, Katharine. Thank you so much for that information. So just wanted to remind folks that there are 2 more information sessions scheduled, one next week, one 2 weeks from today, on other elements of the practice model. So next week we're looking at trauma-informed care in the context of schools, highlighting some pilot efforts that are happening here in Minnesota that have been funded by the Sauer Family Foundation. So I encourage you to participate in that next Thursday, the 24th, 1 o'clock. And then 2 weeks out on Thursday, the 31st, we have a session focused on the San Francisco schools and Hamilton Family Services pilot, where the folks that really started up and are operating that pilot. It was a Google-funded pilot that's now kind of evolved into a larger campaign throughout San Francisco to end student and family homelessness. They'll talk a little bit about what they did and the partnership that they created between the schools and Hamilton Family Services. So excited about both of those sessions. That second session is at 1:30 on the 31st. Both of those sessions are 90 minutes long. There's the link at the bottom of the page here for how you get more information and sign up. And then lastly, here's just a slide that contains some links for you to have around the Homework Starts with Home initiative itself. So the Homework Starts with Home webpage for the Minnesota Department of Education is the top link. The Minnesota Housing Multifamily Grants page includes the RFP, the responses to some of the questions that we've received so far, and some other materials. And then again, that link for the info sessions. Finally, if you have any questions as you're thinking about your application and designing your program, please do reach out if you have questions to Diane Elias, whose contact information is provided there. And with that, thank you very much for being here today and for participating in this session.